This morning we are continuing our journey through the Gospel of John. Today we pick up in chapter 12. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to John chapter 12. It's right after chapter 11, right before chapter 13. And so if you don't have a Bible, we have Bibles in the pew in front of you that you can grab and look on to as well. Chapter 12, Jesus arrives outside Jerusalem. It's just before Passover, just to give you some context as you're reading this. And this Passover, it's the most important week in Jesus' time on earth, when he'll go to the cross and arise from the dead. So we are right at the end of Jesus' ministry, where it's at its zenith here, getting ready to go to its zenith. Now, last week, we left off, we finished up chapter 11. Pastor Chuck finished up chapter 11, and we left off with more trouble for Jesus with these Jewish religious leaders, namely the chief priests. If you remember, after raising his friend Lazarus from the dead, the leaders realized that if Jesus were to be able to continue, or if he continued to minister in such a way, everybody would believe in him. Oh no, what a tragedy, right? And they see that as a threat. They see that as a negative. So they make the decision. Before they just wanted to kill him, but now they make the formal decision that Jesus must be put to death. And because of this, Jesus goes from Bethany to a place called Ephraim, which is on the edge of the wilderness. It's about 15 miles away because it's not yet his time, right? So he goes to Ephraim in the wilderness. Now, as chapter 12 begins, it's a couple months later that Jesus is now gone and approaching the Passover. So let's read our passage this morning, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it means and what it means for us today as well. So chapter 12, verse 1, it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. All right, well, let's go through this passage. There's actually two kind of incidents happening here. One inside a house and one right outside the house, but they're related to each other. And I want to take a little bit of time so we can look at what's happening, so we can understand why this is important. This account is important, not only for those that are experiencing it at the time, but also for us today. So let's kind of dive in right with verse 1. And again, it's a couple months later at this point, and it's nearing Passover. It's actually Passover week. So Passover is just less than a week away, and Jesus comes near to Jerusalem. Now, Jesus isn't coming to stay in Jerusalem. If you remember that the orders the chief priest gave is if Jesus is in Jerusalem, people need to tell them so that they can come arrest him and kill him. It's not his time yet. So Jesus doesn't stay in Jerusalem, but rather he's staying in Bethany. Bethany's about 2 miles right outside of Jerusalem. So although he's not staying in Jerusalem, he's very close, so he can go in and out of Jerusalem as he sees fit. And it's a safer place for him to stay until it is his time. Now, Jesus most likely arrives here at Bethlehem on a Friday, early on a Friday, right before the Sabbath, and then he enjoys Sabbath day with his friends here. and he's probably staying at the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And then they enjoy the Sabbath rest, and now it's Saturday evening when they have this big celebration for him, or in his honor, actually in him and in Lazarus' honor. Now, John emphasizes that Lazarus is at this supper, right? John emphasizes this because Lazarus figures very prominently in the demonstration of the power of Jesus as the Son of God. Remember, John wants us to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and in believing we may find life in his name. So he prominently focuses on Lazarus, talking about him twice here, that he's there. And what we find out, though, is this supper isn't held at the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Actually, 2 other gospel accounts talk about this incident. And in Mark's gospel, it says that this is at the home of a man named Simon, and Simon the leper. So this guy Simon, he's probably friends with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And it seems that because he's called Simon the leper, but he's in public, Jesus probably healed him at some time previous, although we're not told that specifically, but we can kind of glean that Jesus probably healed him, so he knows Jesus. They have this connection with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and so he kind of hosts it at his home, and possibly because maybe his home's bigger, because as we start to count the people at this supper, I count at least 17 people that are at this supper, so it's growing a little bit large, because the disciples of Jesus are present. John doesn't mention the disciples. He only mentions one disciple that's there. But the other gospel writers, Matthew particularly, mentions that the other disciples are there as well. So that's 12 added to the 5 with Simon, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus. So that's 17 at least that we know that are there. And John doesn't mention the other disciples because, again, he's trying to highlight something specific here. Give the details that help us believe in Jesus as the Christ and respond to him. So he's going to give us what's important out of this because there is all this other information out there already, so he doesn't need to restate that. Now, at this supper, it mentions that Martha is busy serving. So Martha, even though it's not her home, is probably acting as the host. And this seems to be her gift that God gives her, a way that she can worship, and she's worshiping in this way joyfully. So this act of worship and serving this meal. Lazarus is also worshiping at this supper. It says that he's worshiping kind of as a student, as he's reclining next to Jesus, and they're asking questions and learning from Jesus and all of that. And then there's Mary, their sister. And Mary comes, and she does this beautiful act of worship. And the reason why she's doing this beautiful act of worship is on the account of Jesus raising her brother Lazarus from the dead. You remember her desperation last chapter where she comes and falls at the feet of Jesus saying, "Why weren't you here?" And Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. So she's so grateful and so joyous in Jesus that she does this beautiful act of worship that we read here. And what she does is, and the other gospel writers say, this ointment was in an alabaster jar. Now, an alabaster jar is expensive in and of itself. And she takes, and it's filled with this costly perfumed ointment made of pure nard, it says. What is nard? That doesn't sound like a good perfume name, does it? But what nard is it's this aromatic herb that is grown in the Himalaya mountains, so up between India and Tibet, so way up high in the mountains. And harvesting and processing and then transporting this, as it's made into an ointment, transporting this to Israel would have made this a very costly and precious item. I mean, there was a lot to go into getting it. So that's why it was a costly item, and it was so precious to have. In fact, we see in verse 5, Judas actually values this as 300 denarii, is what he says. Now, what's a denarii? Well, 300 denarii is equivalent to probably a year's salary for the average worker of the day. So if we were going to kind of put the worth in today's dollars in our setting, think of what an average salary of a person makes in a year, and that's how much that she is lavishing on Jesus here. Now, Matthew and Mark, they mention that when she anoints Jesus' head. While John says she pours it on his feet. And the truth is, with a pound of nard, there's enough to be able to do all of this, and then some. More than enough. It's so generous that she wipes the excess off of Jesus' feet with her hair. So imagine it's puddling up under Jesus, and she's wiping it up with her hair. This act, it would have stood out. I mean, people would have noticed this, that this was all happening. And it talks about the aroma of this filling the entire house, right? So it's blessing everybody because they're smelling this beautiful aroma. It's kind of like potpourri in your house. And the whole house kind of smells of this beautiful perfumed ointment. Now picture this scene. Everybody's kind of basking in the presence of Jesus, and they're celebrating his work, and they're serving him, and things are going awesome, right? Things couldn't be higher, and everybody's saying, man, isn't Jesus awesome? Aren't we just so blessed to be here? Everything is going great. And then in comes a dark cloud. Have you ever had somebody in your life like that? That's the dark cloud. You know, no matter how great everything is going, they always seem to kind of deflate a room. Everything seems to be going great, and they point out something and say, well, it would be great if. And they always seem to find something to complain about. So into this high point of what's happening with this supper, John then just introduces one of the followers of Jesus, one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, verse 4, right? So it's at this high point of celebration that one of Jesus' disciples, Judas, he chimes in. And again, while the other disciples are there, John only mentions Judas. And John also is quick to note that it's Judas who would betray Jesus. They didn't know that, none of them knew this at the time. Only Jesus and Judas knew this, that he was going to betray Jesus. But anyway, instead of celebrating Mary's act of worship, he criticizes it. He criticizes it as being wasteful. And he says, wait a minute, we could sell this and think of all the good we could do with it. You know, we could help feed the poor and give them what they might need. And while that's a good thing, it's not better than what Mary did with it, as we're going to see and as Jesus is quick to point out. But Judas kind of looks at that and says it's being wasteful. In fact, what John reveals here, and John learns this after the fact, he didn't know this at the time, but again, he's looking back at this incident, and he mentions Judas didn't give a lick about the poor. You know, Judas is trying to sound all high and mighty, saying, look, we could do this, and look at all the good we can do. He doesn't care about the poor. The reality is, Judas is a thief. And as the keeper of their money, he's kind of the treasurer of the disciples, make sure they have money to stay places and get their food. Well, as the keeper of all that money, he would skim money off the top whenever they would get money, and he'd take a little pocket a little for himself. So that if they would sell this ointment for 300 denarii, he'd have a nice little payday for himself. And that's the reality of what Judas is really doing here. And again, nobody knew that about Judas at the time except Jesus and Judas. And because of that, because everybody's looking at Judas and they don't know that he's a thief in this way, and they're saying, well, he's saying we could do good, Matthew actually mentions the other disciples also wonder if Mary isn't being wasteful here as well. So they kind of are brought down with Judas. And Jesus is quick to shut all this down. Look at verse 7. It says, Jesus says, leave her alone. He says this to Judas. So imagine this. Judas is trying to sound all nice, and Jesus is like, hey, you leave her alone. And what he says is he says, you know what she's doing? She's preparing me for burial. You see, this ointment of nard was also used as a burial ointment or as incense for burial when people would die, and you would anoint them with that. And Mary, and the idea is that Mary here, she has heard all of that Jesus had talked about his purpose here on earth, and that he would go and he would die and he would rise again. And she believes him. And she believes that Jesus is God in the flesh, and she trusts him. So she's actually honoring him ahead of the fact, or in faith. And she's saying, I'm anointing you for the work you're about to go do. That's better than even the disciples got at this point, isn't it? And so she's kind of doing all of this kind of in faith. And in fact, she wouldn't be there to go to his tomb to anoint his body. There's 3 other women that go, but she's not one of them. So she probably realizes that, hey, if he dies, I probably won't be able to be there, so I'm going to do this now. So she's honoring him with this. And Jesus continues. And besides that, you talk about the poor. The poor are always going to be with us, but I won't always be here. So she's doing the greater thing. And Jesus isn't saying here that the poor don't matter or helping with the poor doesn't matter. What he's saying is that's always going to be an issue this side of heaven. We're always going to have ministry we can do. You see, this is a truth in ministry, even here at Joy Community Fellowship. There's a lot of things that we can do, but there's only so many things we should do. And we need to kind of look at prioritizing things. So Jesus is like, yeah, the poor are always going to be here, but the reality is I'm not always going to be here. So while I'm here, you should be worshiping me in the flesh. And so that's what he's kind of pointing out here. So he kind of shuts this down, and this is what's going on inside the house. Now, outside the house, or outside in the village of Bethany, a crowd begins to gather. Word had spread that Jesus was there, so many come to see him, and they come to see Lazarus, right? Because he had raised Lazarus, so they want to see it for themselves. Now, remember, it's Passover, so people are coming from all over, all right, Israel and, Galilee and Judea and even other parts of the Roman Empire. Jews are hearing about this, and they want to see it for themselves. And they all want to come and see Jesus and Lazarus, who that he raised. And it actually says at the end that many people came to believe in Jesus because of this, because they came here. Now, the chief priests hear about all this, and they know they need to put a stop to it. He's not in Jerusalem, so they really can't grab him at this point. So what they decide, we already are killing one guy in Jesus, so let's destroy the evidence as well. And they say, so they plan on killing Lazarus, because Lazarus is a living, breathing billboard of the power of Jesus, right? He's the example. He's the evidence of Jesus' power, that he once was dead and now he's alive. So if we remove him, then there's no evidence. And we're like, what do you mean? Show us this guy. He's not around. So it's a way that they can kind of keep their control. So they make a decision not only to kill Jesus, but to kill Lazarus as well. How far our lengths will go to keep from worshiping Jesus. Right? So anyway, that's what's happening here in this passage. It's quite a dinner, isn't it? Quite a night that's going on. And it's just going to go from here as John spends the rest of his gospel in this last week of Jesus' life, these last few days with the cross and the trial and the resurrection of Jesus. But in addition to this passage kind of building this tension that's going on, right, that will eventually lead to the cross, this incident also teaches us something important about worship. Remember, last week, Pastor Chuck was talking about that wherever Jesus is and whenever we encounter Jesus, it kind of demands a response, right? It commands a response on our part. Well, the correct response to Jesus is worship. So here, he's giving an example of what worship should be. And it teaches us something important about worship and worshiping Jesus. You see, worship is never wasted when it's given to Jesus. Did you get that? If we remember one thing from this passage, we can remember this, and remember with Mary's act of worship. Worship is never wasted when our worship is given to Jesus. And that's what this is kind of, John makes this clear distinction in this passage of who truly worships Jesus and those who waste their worship. Basically, those who are frauds in their faith, those who are just faking it and missing what it means to truly worship Jesus. So we have true worshipers like Mary and Martha and Lazarus and even the crowds that gather, that come out to Bethlehem. And then we have those that are frauds in the faith, right? False worshipers like Judas and these religious leaders who look holy on the outside, but they have evil intentions in their heart. In fact, it's through our passage this morning, kind of as we wrap a lot of this together, that we discover some of these marks of the things that mark true worship of Jesus. Not only for these people, but for our lives today, and how we can be true worshipers, or what should mark us as a true worshiper of Jesus rather than being a fake worshiper of Jesus. And what we find is a couple of these marks. You see, true worshipers of Jesus, we find, first of all, in our passage, they give freely. True worshipers of Jesus give freely. As true worshipers, we worship right where we are with what we have and all that we have. This is Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Or an example of this, Martha joyfully serves, right? She's serving this meal with great joy and energy and putting it together to make sure that this meal is great and Jesus is taken care of. And it's interesting because Martha wasn't always like this. In fact, Luke talks about an incident that happened earlier in the ministry of Jesus where Jesus is over at a house where Mary and Martha are, and Martha is busy getting all the details together and serving while Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet. And Martha gets ticked off and says, "Why am I doing everything and Mary just gets to sit there? Why aren't I being recognized? Why don't I get to do anything fun?" And so that's what we see here. She says, and she tells Jesus, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me all alone to serve? Tell her to come and help me." And that's where Jesus says, well, she's doing the more important thing because she was worshiping. And Martha, in being consumed with just serving, missed her chance to worship. But now time has gone by, and she starts to realize, wait a minute, this is how God has gifted me, with hospitality. And my serving here is an act of worship to Jesus. So now she's doing it with joy. She's not complaining about it, but she's joyous about it. And she's giving herself freely, again, through her hospitality. Lazarus also is giving himself to Jesus, right? Giving himself to listen to Jesus and to sit at Jesus' feet. And then Mary, we see, giving herself freely, right? She joins in with this costly gift given in worship to Jesus. Now, in contrast to these true worshipers, we have fake worshipers, those who are kind of faking their way towards it. You see, instead of giving freely, they give or they serve with an agenda or with strings attached. We see this with Judas, right? He's quick to insert his agenda of what he thought was good worship. As he criticizes Mary, he says, wait a minute, this is what worship is, Jesus. So he's basically teaching Jesus what worship is. But he's saying, no, this isn't what I would think worship is. This is what worship should be. This is my agenda. And for him, worship was his way, for his purpose, and for his outcome, which was eventually for himself. The religious leaders had a similar take on this kind of worship as they served to be served, right? This is one of the things Jesus got in their case. He says, everything you do is outward appearance while your heart is evil. But they served so that others can serve them and recognize them. And that was their agenda. They wanted to hold their power. And they were protecting themselves. You know, we can come and we can worship God with agendas too, can't we? Have you ever worshiped Jesus and come to worship with an agenda? I mean, we may come to church maybe to impress others or maybe even impress God. You know, hoping that God will bless us because of our commitment or our service. And we say, oh, yeah, God will be, you know, oh, it's raining today. I got up and came in the rain. Won't God be impressed with me? And we kind of have that agenda saying, you know, well, maybe if I do something good for God, God will do something good for me. Or maybe we serve in certain areas because we want to be recognized by people, or we want people to pat us on the back and say, man, you're awesome, you're good. And that's why we're serving. We're serving so that we can be praised by others or recognized by others. You know, and Paul has something to say about this. Actually, he quotes the book of Job in Romans, where he's talking about giving to God and this kind of agenda and having an agenda with God. And in some ways, this is probably one of the most challenging verses in all of Scripture, I know, for my life, because it helped me. Because I know I can be challenged to try to have an agenda in what I do. And here's what he says in Romans 11. He says, who has ever given a gift to him that he should be repaid? Some versions say, who has ever given to God that God should repay him? And yet sometimes we do that, don't we? We think we do something good for God, so God owes us. You know, God, I've done you a solid. I mean, throw me a bone, right? And when we kind of get in that mindset where we do something with an agenda rather than just freely giving ourselves to Jesus in worship. And look at Mary. Once she got that ointment, once she broke that jar, it was done with that ointment. She didn't worry about it. She gave it freely to him, not expecting anything back from it. You see, in true worship, we give of ourselves, we give of our gifts or our talents and our time and our resources freely to honor Jesus because of who he is and because of what he's done. That's why we do it. It's a response, as Pastor Chuck talked about last week. In fact, Paul in Colossians says it like this: whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. You see, giving ourselves freely is looking at that and saying, it just doesn't happen on Sundays when I come, but I can give my time at work or my time with my kids or, you know, just hanging out with my friends. I can give that time to him as worship and dedicate it to him. You see, in worship, we respond to Jesus wherever we are and with whatever he places before us. And we do it with joy and thanks as a response. Now, we not only find that true worshipers give freely, what we also find in our passage is true worshipers also prioritize Jesus. So if we want to truly worship, not only do we give of ourselves and all that we have freely to God, but we also make Jesus a priority. The focus and the goal of our worship is on Jesus, for Jesus, and about Jesus. As true worshipers, we're not to be concerned about what others may think of us or may judge us about. We should be concerned about lifting up Jesus, about Jesus being seen. Mary's a beautiful picture of this, isn't she, in this passage? I mean, she took this costly possession and she gave it to Jesus, not concerned with what she gave up, not concerned of what she might have given up with the cost of this. You see, there's no price too high that is high enough to be worthy of Jesus. So she looks at that and says, I wish I had more to give, but there's nothing I could ever give that matches him. There's no price. And she also didn't care about what others thought of her or what she looked like in her act of worship. She only wanted to honor Jesus. I mean, imagine this scene. They're at a dinner, and they're reclining at the table and think they're cleaning up the food and things like that. And Mary comes out with this alabaster jar, and she smashes it. She breaks it. Everybody's like, what is she doing? And then she pours it on Jesus while Jesus is talking to other people. And you're like, what are you doing? And it smells, and everybody's like, wow, that's strong. And she starts, she starts taking this lowly position, right, where she's anointing Jesus in front of everybody, but she takes the role of this lowly servant. You see, because cleaning somebody's feet was the job of the lowliest servant. It was like the lowest person on the totem pole would help clean people's feet when they came in. But it's foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do in just a couple chapters that we're going to see when he washes his disciples' feet. But Mary takes on that form of a servant, doesn't care of her position or anything like that, and takes this lowly position to honor Jesus. Others may have thought this was beneath her, but Jesus was our priority. So Jesus was worth it. And an even more shocking move, as this ointment begins to overflow and there's excess ointment all over Jesus' feet, she lets down her hair. Now, culturally, this is a big deal. Because culturally, Jewish women had to have their hair up, right? And they had it covered at all times. And they were never to let their hair down in public or in front of men. Never. That was like a big no-no. It was kind of like, almost like a floozy. Only a floozy would do that. You know, you're very loose in what you're doing, and wow, that's inappropriate. She sees that this oil is a kind of excess oil, so she doesn't worry what people think of her, and they may judge her and may look down on her or think it's inappropriate. She just takes her hair down and starts wiping the ointment with her hair. Again, she wasn't worried about damaging her reputation. She was focused on Jesus and honoring him alone. In contrast to that, we have Judas, right? This fake worshiper whose priority was himself, as John points out. He wasn't even concerned about the poor. He was concerned about the money he could make and what he could put in his own pocket. He was the priority in his worship and in following Jesus. In fact, what's probably going through his mind, all right, Jesus has been talking about going to that he's going to be killed, and I thought we were going to reign with him, and I thought we were going to be set, but now he's not going to be around anymore. I need to look out for myself. In fact, a few days later, when he betrays Jesus, he takes a little bit more money to pad his pockets to take care of himself. What's his priority? I need to take care of myself, and it's for my gain. In a similar way, the religious leaders show that they're more of a priority than Jesus. I mean, they act all pious, yet they want to kill somebody, which is in the very law that they are supposed to be experts in, right? Do not murder. Not only once, but now they want to do it twice, so that they can keep their position over the people, because that's what their priority is. They need to keep their voice and keep their position over the people. You see, Jesus should be our focus. Jesus should be the goal of our worship. We shouldn't be worrying about what we look like or how we worship sometimes, We shouldn't be here on a Sunday morning worried if other people may look down on us because we have our hands raised in worship and we may be the only ones, or we may be the only ones who don't raise our hands in worship and we sit there and say, oh, I'm all embarrassed. That shouldn't even enter our mind because we're worshiping Jesus. We shouldn't worry what others think of us, reading our Bible at work or coming to church, making priority of coming to church. Or going to a Bible study during the midweek and telling our friends, I need to go here. Why don't you come with me? We do these things to honor and to follow Jesus. In fact, Jesus talked about this, and Luke kind of notes it. He says, if anybody would come after me, he says, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. It's not about us. Whoever loses life for my sake will save it. For what is the profit of man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits his soul? Jesus is to be our priority. We aren't to come to church or to go to a study to network with other people, grow a business, or to impress others, or to score points with other people or with God. We're to come to worship him, to simply seek and honor him. True worshipers prioritize Jesus. And then finally, as we see a result that happens of these true worshipers of Jesus, those who truly worship Jesus and have been changed by him, we discover that these true worshipers not only give freely and prioritize Jesus, but they also draw others. You see, we're a true worshiper when we draw others in to worship Jesus. True worshipers, in pointing to and honoring Jesus, draw others to the greatness of him so that they too can come and worship. True worship is infectious. Just as Mary's worship and the gift of this ointment, it blessed Jesus, but the aroma also filled the house, blessing everybody that's there. And this pleasing aroma and the greatness and showing the greatness of Jesus. And then we have Lazarus, right? Lazarus is living and he's breathing and he's talking, right? So as he lived, he breathed and he celebrated Jesus. He's this living example of the power of Jesus in giving life and this nature of Jesus. And so others are drawn to him, as we find out at the end of the passage. Because they saw Lazarus in the flesh, they realized Jesus has this power. Now, imagine that with us. As we are changed, right? Those who are in Christ are a new creation. The old is gone. Behold, the new has come. And we live our life as a new, brand new living creation of Jesus. We point to his life-giving forgiveness and his mercy and his power to change a life. And when we worship, we draw others to worship. So true worship gathers other worshipers together in unity to focus on Jesus because he's our priority. He's the one we're focusing on. In contrast, fraudulent worshipers or false worshipers, they tear apart. Those who are in it for themselves or are faking that and faking worship tear apart. We see this in Judas, right? He's this wet blanket in this party, right? In an otherwise glorious evening, what does he do? He criticizes. He tries to tear apart. He tries to win other people over to his side of thinking. So now there's this tension in the room where there wasn't tension before. Everybody's celebrating. Everybody's great. And now Judas brings this up. And what does he do? All of a sudden there's tension with the disciples and him and Mary and Martha and Jesus and all of these. The religious leaders also were doing that, weren't they? They're in this for their own worship. The religious leaders, instead of celebrating a man, a Jew, so they should be happy about this, who was raised from the dead, given new life in Lazarus, instead they try to destroy him. You see how one brings together, draws together, the other tears apart. And those that fake are tearing apart. You see, our own worship will either draw others to Jesus or discourage and drive people away. In fact, those who are most critical about worship, those who come in and are judging other people in their worship or judging when God begins to work and we bring up and criticize or find something negative, you know, they often are the ones most lacking in themselves in true worship. And what they're doing is they want to feel better about themselves or they want to cover themselves. Isn't that what Judas is doing here? He sees this great act of worship. He probably feels very convicted here. So he needs to make himself look better or cover himself because he's not a good worshiper. And he says, oh, we can give to the poor. Wouldn't that be a great thing to do? Again, we can care about the poor, but we care about the poor and we do all of these works because we worship Jesus. Not before we worship Jesus. If we do all these good works before we worship Jesus, we do those works for ourselves. They become self-centered works. You see, but when we come and we worship Jesus, he draws us together. So therefore, then that kind of just overflows out in those good works because they become an act of worship. And that's what's happening here. And our worship of Jesus, it should welcome and encourage others to worship unified in Jesus and him alone. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is getting at, where he talks about, let us hold fast this confession of our faith without wavering, for he who promises faithful. Let us focus on Jesus and the faith we have in him and who he is. And he says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, how we can be drawn together in our worship. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another or uniting in worship. All the more as we see the day approaching. And that's what we're called to do. And true worshipers draw together to lift up Jesus. That's why we're not called to be solo worshipers. Yes, we should be worshiping in our everyday lives, but this is why the gathering together as a congregation, right, as his people together is so powerful. Is because we come together and we unify around him. We all have different backgrounds and different experiences, and we're maybe, different jobs and all of these things, yet we can come together, and we might not have much in common outside of Jesus, but we have Jesus in common, and we get to unify in him. True worshipers draw together. Are others drawn closer to Jesus because of you? Or are they driven further away? Once again, worship is never wasted when it's given to Jesus. Our commitment to Jesus of our time and our talent and our resources is never wasted when we're truly worshiping Jesus. Instead, we're encouraged and we're built up in him as we freely give ourselves because he is worthy. As we make him a priority over everything because he's our life. And we draw others to worship him by pointing them to Jesus. The reality is that we're either truly worshiping Jesus, or we're not worshiping at all. And these are marks that we know when we're truly worshiping. So be encouraged this morning, but also be challenged to examine how we approach Jesus in our worship so that we can become true worshipers of Jesus, so that we can point others to him and him alone right where we are for our world, our co-workers and our family and all around us to see. Be a true worshiper. Let's pray.